June 14, 1964. Four teenagers went to the shores of Lake Crescent in Washington for a weekend camping trip. By dawn, three of them had vanished without a trace. The sole survivor was found with severe head trauma and couldn't remember what happened. The bodies were never found. The killer was never found. And 40 years later, DNA evidence pointed to a shocking suspect. Don't forget to subscribe, because this is one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries in the world. Miranda Whitmore, 17 years old, bright and ambitious, was planning to study biology in college. Thomas Blackwell, 19 years old, Miranda's boyfriend, worked at his father's lumber mill. Daniel Cross, 19 years old, Thomas's best friend, was quiet and hardworking. Catherine Hayes, 16 years old, Daniel's girlfriend, was small and shy but adventurous. The four teenagers loaded camping gear into Thomas's 1962 Ford Galaxy on a Friday afternoon in June. They were heading to Lake Crescent, a glacial lake carved deep into the Olympic Mountains. The destination was isolated, surrounded by dense old-growth forests, and accessible only by poorly maintained dirt roads. They stopped in Port Angeles to pick up supplies, and the cashier would later remember their excitement. They arrived at the campsite on the western shore just before sunset, around 6:45 p.m. The location was perfect for privacy. No other campers, no ranger patrols, just giant Douglas firs and the mirror-like lake stretching into the distance. Setting up camp took about an hour. By 8 p.m., the fire was burning and they were making hot dogs. A fisherman named Robert Morrison was fishing for trout half a mile down. He later told police he saw their campfire that evening and heard faint laughter carrying across the water. Nothing unusual, just kids having fun. The last photograph, recovered weeks later from 15 feet deep, showed all of them sitting around the campfire at 9:47 p.m. They were smiling, completely unaware they had less than 3 hours left to live. By 10 p.m., the fire had turned to ash. The four teenagers entered their tent, placing their sleeping bags side by side. Thomas and Miranda on one side, Daniel and Catherine on the other. The tent zipper was closed from the inside. Somewhere between midnight and 4 a.m., violence erupted. Robert Morrison returned to his fishing spot at dawn, just after 5 a.m. As his boat passed by the campsite, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The tent had collapsed on one side, the canvas torn and flapping in the morning breeze. Sleeping bags were scattered around, one dragged halfway toward the water, and gear was overturned. Morrison pulled his boat to shore and approached carefully, calling out but getting no answer. Inside the torn tent, he found Daniel Cross barely alive. The young man's face was a mask of blood. His skull was fractured, his jaw shattered. Blood had soaked through his sleeping bag and pooled on the tent floor. He was making small, helpless moaning sounds. Morrison raced to the nearest ranger station 3 miles away. By 6:15 a.m., emergency response teams were rushing to the scene. Detective Warren Hayes arrived from Port Angeles at 7:30 a.m., leading a team of county sheriffs and park rangers. What they found would haunt investigators for decades. The tent had been slashed from the outside with something sharp, probably a hunting knife. Multiple cuts, wild and deliberate. The canvas was shredded in places. The sleeping bags showed signs of violent struggle. Thomas's wallet was lying on the ground outside the tent, empty. His car keys were missing from his pocket. Catherine's shoes remained inside the tent, but Catherine was gone. Most disturbing were the drag marks. Clear tracks in the dirt from the tent to the water's edge showed something heavy had been pulled toward the lake. The tracks disappeared at the waterline, as if whatever was being dragged had been pulled into the water. Daniel Cross was transported to Port Angeles Hospital in critical condition. Doctors worked for hours to stabilize him. He had been struck multiple times with a blunt object, probably a rock or metal pipe. His skull was fractured in 3 places. The amount of blood loss should have killed him. 3 days later, when he regained consciousness, Daniel couldn't speak because of his broken jaw. The disappearance of the 3 teenagers triggered one of the largest search operations in Washington state history. More than 200 volunteers combed the forest surrounding Lake Crescent for weeks. Professional divers plunged repeatedly into the icy water, dropping to over 600 feet in some places. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning miles of dense wilderness with thermal imaging equipment. They found almost nothing. Thomas Blackwell's Ford Galaxy remained parked at the trailhead. The car keys were never found. Catherine Hayes' jacket was found half a mile away, torn and heavily bloodstained. Forensic analysis confirmed the blood was hers. Miranda Whitmore's camera was recovered from the lake bottom at 15 feet deep. Search teams dragged sections of the lake, but after 6 weeks of intensive searching, the operation was officially suspended. Miranda Whitmore, Thomas Blackwell, and Catherine Hayes were declared missing, presumed dead. Daniel Cross remained in the hospital for 3 months. Multiple complex surgeries rebuilt his jaw and repaired his fractured skull. Physical therapy helped him walk and speak again, but all memory of that night was gone. Neurologists explained that severe head trauma frequently causes retrograde amnesia, erasing memories immediately before and during the traumatic event. Detective Hayes pressed him again and again. Any sounds, any images. Daniel desperately tried to remember, underwent hypnosis, worked with memory specialists, but he couldn't remember anything after falling asleep in his sleeping bag. Psychological evaluation and lie detector tests cleared Daniel of wrongdoing. The severity of his injuries proved he was a victim. Someone had tried to kill him too. He had just miraculously survived. Without bodies, and with the only witness remembering nothing, Detective Hayes focused on identifying potential suspects in the area. The first was Harold Vance, a 58-year-old reclusive man living in a primitive cabin 3 miles from the campsite. Vance was known to local rangers as hostile to campers, frequently complaining that they disturbed wildlife and left trash. He had been arrested twice in previous years for threatening hikers who got too close to his property. When questioned 2 days after the attack, Vance admitted seeing the teenagers' campfire the night they disappeared. He claimed he was night fishing nearby, but returned to his cabin around 10 p.m. and saw nothing unusual. No one could verify his alibi. He lived completely alone. With a search warrant, they thoroughly searched Vance's cabin. They found a hunting knife, but forensic testing detected no blood on the blade. His boots didn't match any prints found near the tent. Still, the man's complete lack of emotion when told 3 teenagers were missing, presumably dead, disturbed investigators. In the following years, other theories emerged and faded. A drifter known to pass through the area, a fugitive convict spotted in Washington at the time, even speculation about someone specifically targeting young campers in remote locations. But without physical evidence, without bodies, without witnesses, the investigation slowly went cold. By 1970, the case file was gathering dust in storage. The families never stopped searching, but law enforcement had nowhere else to look. In 2003, nearly 40 years after the attack, Detective Lisa Montgomery from the Port Angeles Police Department reopened the Lake Crescent case. Advances in DNA analysis technology had revolutionized forensic science since 1964. Evidence that was useless then could now provide answers. Montgomery located the preserved physical evidence: Daniel's blood-stained sleeping bag, the torn tent canvas, Catherine's jacket. These items had been kept sealed in evidence bags in climate-controlled storage for nearly 40 years. She contacted Daniel Cross, now 58 years old, living in California with his wife and 2 children. He had built a successful engineering career but rarely spoke about Lake Crescent. The scar on his temple was a permanent reminder of that night. Montgomery requested a DNA sample to use as a reference. Daniel immediately agreed. 3 months later, the lab results came in. They had found something extraordinary. The blood on Catherine's jacket had yielded a partial DNA profile. More importantly, traces of someone else's DNA were on the fabric of Daniel's sleeping bag, probably transferred during the violent struggle. The profile matched Harold Vance. There was one devastating problem. Harold Vance had died in 1987, 17 years earlier. He had been found hanging from a beam in his cabin, dead for approximately 3 days before discovery. Local authorities ruled it suicide. Vance had no family, no friends, no one to question the finding. But now, in 2003, DNA evidence definitively placed him inside that tent during the attack. His genetic material was on Daniel's sleeping bag and on the torn tent fabric. He was there. He participated in the violence. Montgomery traveled to Spokane to give Daniel the news in person. After 40 years, they finally had a name. But the man had long since died, beyond justice, beyond questioning. Then, Montgomery uncovered something even more disturbing. Physical evidence suggested there were two attackers, blood spatter patterns, the nature of the wounds, drag marks going in different directions. Everything pointed to two individuals working together, coordinating the attack. Harold Vance had not acted alone. He had an accomplice, and that person had never been identified, never faced consequences, had lived freely for 40 years while 3 families suffered without answers. Montgomery authorized a full forensic excavation of Harold Vance's abandoned property. The cabin had partially collapsed, overrun with vegetation, but beneath the rotted floorboards, investigators found something that turned the case into something much darker. A carefully sealed and buried metal box. Inside were jewelry from young women, pieces clearly not belonging to a man living alone in the wilderness, an expensive men's wristwatch, multiple sets of car keys, and most chilling, photographs, dozens of them, surveillance photos showing various campsites in Olympic National Park, apparently taken from a distance without the subject's knowledge. One photograph froze Montgomery's blood. Thomas Blackwell's Ford Galaxy, parked at the Lake Crescent trailhead. The photo was time-stamped, June 14, 1964, 4:30 p.m., hours before the attack. Harold Vance had been watching them, following them, planning. The jewelry was traced through missing persons databases. 3 matches came back, young couples who disappeared while camping in Olympic National Park in the 1950s and early 1960s. Their bodies had never been found. The cases had gone cold decades ago. Harold Vance hadn't attacked just once. For years, maybe decades, he was a serial predator, targeting vulnerable campers in isolated locations. He had perfected his method, learned from experience, and never got caught in his lifetime. But the second DNA profile found at Lake Crescent remained unidentified. The sample was too degraded for comparison without a specific suspect to test against. Whoever helped Vance that night remained a ghost. In 2005, forensic psychologist Dr. Richard Klein published an analysis that shocked the true crime community and devastated the families involved. Klein suggested that the second attacker might have been Daniel Cross himself. His theory focused on dissociative fugue, a rare psychological phenomenon where extreme trauma causes a person to act in ways they later cannot remember. Klein pointed to Daniel's complete memory loss, his survival when the other 3 disappeared, and the fact that his DNA was clearly present throughout the crime scene. Klein proposed that Daniel might have participated in the attack while in an altered mental state. Then his brain completely blocked the memory when confronted with the horror of what he had done. The head trauma could have been accidental injury during the violence or even self-inflicted at the moment of awareness. The theory ignited fierce debate. Some found it compelling, others called it cruel speculation against a victim who had already suffered too much. But the theory attracted enough attention that prosecutors in Clallam County made a controversial decision. In 2006, they brought 3 counts of first-degree murder charges against Daniel Cross. Daniel Cross's trial began in January 2007 and immediately became a national media sensation. The prosecution built their case on Klein's psychological theory, presenting multiple expert witnesses testifying about dissociative states and repressed memory. Why had only he survived when the attacker clearly tried to kill everyone? Independent forensic pathologists reviewed Daniel's medical records and injury documentation. Daniel's wounds were consistent with being a victim, not a perpetrator. The first blow had fractured his skull while he lay in his sleeping bag. Subsequent blows were attempts to finish him off. Most critically, the defense presented the DNA evidence. The unknown second profile did not match Daniel Cross. Daniel testified for 3 days. He described his life after the attack, the crushing guilt of survival, decades of therapy trying to recover memories that never returned, the nightmares that never ended. "I would give anything to remember," he said, his voice breaking. When Daniel Cross died in 2019 at age 74, his family found something unexpected among his belongings, a journal written over the years in increasingly shaky handwriting. Most entries were mundane, but toward the end, there was something he had never told anyone. He did remember something, a moment that kept returning in his dreams over the decades. An unfamiliar voice in the darkness, cold, "Leave the kid, he won't remember." And Harold Vance's voice, which Daniel recognized from police interviews during the investigation, answering, "He's seen too much." Daniel had kept this fragment hidden, perhaps afraid it would be used against him, but the journal entry confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Harold Vance had not acted alone that night. That person walked away from Lake Crescent in 1964 and blended into an ordinary life, carrying an extraordinary secret.